This episode is brought to you by Progressive, where drivers who save by switching save nearly $750 on average. Quote now at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates, national average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, March 12, 1961, speaking at the White House to more than 200 Latin American diplomats, President John F. Kennedy called for what he was dubbing the Alliance for Progress. It was a, quote, vast cooperative effort, unparalleled in magnitude and nobility of purpose to satisfy the basic needs of Latin American people for, and I'm quoting here, homes, work and land, health and schools. And then JFK says that in Spanish, he says, techo, trabajo y tierra, salud y escuela. And let me just say that JFK's accent was not as good as mine. I'm going to go out on a limb and say, folks. He went on, though, to flex that accent a little bit more. He said, our motto is what it has always been, progress, yes, tyranny, no. Progreso sí, tirania no.
Now do that in a Boston accent.
Yeah, exactly. Probably with a drink and a half in me. But let's talk about more than just JFK's probably terrible Spanish accent. This is really about one of Kennedy's first big foreign policy swings, trying to define the Cold War policy in a critical part of the world. So let's go to that moment, that gathering in 1961. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
I don't get to flex my Spanish accent that much on the show, so there you go. One funny thing on the accent thing is also, you know, I just imagine Kennedy, the Ich bin Berliner thing, which, you know, played really well for him. And he was like, oh, this is great. I can just do accents and I can do little catchphrases. And even though, of course, he famously
got little characters.
Yeah, exactly. But I could see this in the spirit of that.
It always is weird to me when presidents, I think, speak in another language and you can tell that they have no background at all in speaking the language. It always just is like
just sounding it out.
I mean, look, this is awkward for a number of reasons here. So, you know, I think that there's a much bigger picture here in this moment of 1961 of, you know, kind of what Latin America means for United States foreign policy. I mean, obviously, the main thing on Kennedy's plate is the rising Cold War, though he would obviously end up in lots of Latin American entanglements in the coming years or Caribbean entanglements in the coming years. But like, it's just striking to me that this is kind of one of the first big things he does is gather 200 Latin American diplomats and say, hey, we need not just to play nice, but actually like there's a big ambitious 10-year plan here to support and develop this region.
This seems to me to be very much in line with the Marshall Plan and with the Peace Corps, this idea that in order to win the Cold War, not only does the U.S. have to actively engage all of these other countries, but it needs to provide the goods, right? It has to deliver something in order to win over hearts and minds. It's not just enough to go and talk about democracy, but you gotta make life better. And I think that Kennedy, to a certain extent, got that in an important way, and so develops these big programs, these big aid programs, in an attempt to do that.
Yeah, I think people forget that after World War II, you know, the world was broken economically, politically, socially. I mean, that these were really hard times. And so being able to sort of get on solid grounding with the rest of the world were even harder for countries that had really been underdeveloped by colonialism and dictators.
And there's real fear in this moment after the Cuban Revolution. The idea that communism is on the United States' front doorstep becomes a very real and visceral anxiety. And so the attention that is being turned to Latin America in this moment is not, it's not coincidental, right? There's this idea that you need to lock down the rest of the hemisphere.
Oh, yeah. Because when you think about what poverty, unemployment, crime, like what these things sort of endear, socialism becomes very attractive, I think, to people. And especially when politically, those become the groups that are speaking most to the people who are marginalized and dispossessed.
But I think what you're highlighting here, I mean, obviously there's this, the domino theory is looming large over all of this, but that's not what Kennedy is talking about in this moment. He's not explicitly saying, hey, don't go commie. He's talking about aid and development. And so I think it is worth understanding the kind of bigger picture that this policy seems to take. And I think it's worth also thinking of this in light of the Marshall Plan. It looms over this moment, obviously, but, that is such a clear example of there's intervention and decimation during World War II, and then there's an effort to rebuild. And, I think that this is done in that same spirit, though there is this interesting question or counterfactual or whatever of why there wasn't kind of a Marshall Plan for Latin America. And, I know the war wasn't necessarily playing out in Latin America, but as I think this moment is evincing, there was a larger global struggle and a larger global kind of recovery needed in the wake of World War II, and Latin America was certainly part of that story. So, he doesn't exactly phrase it as this is Latin America's Marshall Plan, but I think it's very much in that spirit rather than in the spirit of let's just intervene and stop the spread of communism.
Right. And that fear and that economic aid go hand in hand, because the reason the Marshall Plan is aimed at Europe in the late 1940s is because there are revolutions breaking out in places like Greece, where they're very concerned that if somebody doesn't intervene and make life better, materially better in these countries, they're all going to move through revolution and you're not going to have peace on the continent. So they sort of try to put out that fire with the Marshall Plan. And then, like you said, Jody, I think that it's helpful to think of this as the Latin American Marshall Plan.
Yeah.
It's a high-stakes election year, so it's not enough to just follow along. You need to understand what's happening so you are fully informed come November. Every weekday on the NPR Politics Podcast, our political reporters break down important stories and backstories from the campaign trail so you understand why it matters to you. Listen to the NPR Politics Podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
All that said, and I know we've gone 6.5 minutes here, and, that I know people who are familiar with the history of U.S. intervention in Latin America and even the kind of downside of economic development programs like USAID, which has had, all sorts of sort of tricky, shadowy sides to its programs throughout Latin America. I understand there are people listening, my parents may be included, who are going, wait a minute. This is not a moment of genuine goodwill and sort of economic uplift, because first off, we know what happens in the wake of this, right? It's not all of a sudden the U.S. and Latin America are stabilized and they're having mutually benefit. It's
what?
Cuba goes sideways very quickly. It becomes a crisis. But even before this, right? We have to say, leading up to this, the U.S. under Eisenhower had supported dictators in Peru, Paraguay, Venezuela. It is actively in this era intervening behind the scenes and militarily throughout the region. And so, I think a big part of this story is not just this is Kennedy's Marshall Plan, but it's also this kind of willful disconnect between the words he's saying to these diplomats and the actual actions that the United States is taking in the region.
I think it's also really important context, too, because of those interventions in the 1950s. The U.S. was really unpopular in Latin America. Right. When Richard Nixon goes down there, he has things thrown at his car and he has to sort of fight his way through very mad crowds. And Kennedy, I think, understands from seeing that we've got to at least make a facial pivot when it comes to Latin America. We're still going to do the interventions and everything, fine. But we've got to add some carrot to this stick, because the U.S.'s reputation is not great in the region.
No.
Some of the specific things in the alliance. There's economic development, there's supporting democratic elections, there's education and literacy, price stability. There's supposed to be a financial commitment, an investment of over $80 billion over 10 years, and the U.S. would provide $20 billion in aid. You can do the math a bunch of different ways. There is a grant in May of 1961 for $500 million that Congress votes on. And then this is also a moment where you see the rise of USAID and the World Bank and, other economic development things. And those are sort of in the spirit of this. But I don't think it's like they come out of this and all of a sudden there is a 10-year Marshall Plan-esque implementation that you can actually point to and say, oh, this Alliance for Progress worked. Or not worked, but was like, there was follow through.
Right. None of the goals of the United States in this plan actually are met. So there is some investment in Latin America, but the U.S. doesn't become suddenly popular in Latin America, especially after the Bay of Pigs, which is later in 1961, which suggests that the U.S.'s interventionist impulses have not died away in the wake of this Alliance for Progress. But also, as you sort of hinted at earlier, Jody, this region does not become an area of flourishing democracies, right? Dictatorship spreads across Latin America throughout the next decade. I think it was 13 constitutional governments over the course of the 1960s are replaced by military dictatorships. So it's just... there was a vision, there was a plan, and it ultimately, I think it's fair to say, fails.
Yeah, I mean, and economically, aside from politically, economically, like those divisions between the haves and the have-nots get even bigger when you have these big corporations and businesses that come in, with opportunities, and those quote-unquote opportunities only serve the corporations themselves. The same with the World Bank, these high interest rates that come in that are intended to bring, development to the countryside, and all they do is continue underdevelopment and sort of handcuff countries from really having economic independence.
That's such a good point. And I mean, it's funny. You could almost think of something we've talked about a lot on this show is the church committee hearings 15 years after this, right? 13 years after this in the mid 70s, which, if you think of these as two brackets of we make all these promises about this Alliance for Progress. And then 12 years later, we're having hearings showing all sorts of CIA meddling throughout the world, including this region. But moreover, Kellie, to your point, and we did an episode about this recently, the church committee hearings also focused a lot on private enterprise and business interventions in foreign countries and the sort of, the shady stew between government and business throughout the region. And so, yes, you can keep those two brackets sort of in mind. One salient fact that I think might kind of tell the story of all of this and sort of in general tell the story of the kind of what's the best and brightest kind of vibe of this era, right? A lot of this was engineered by a man named Richard Goodwin, who was a speechwriter, and he kind of wrote the speech. He came up with the name for Alliance for Progress. He sort of crafted a lot of this policy. The man did not speak Spanish or Portuguese and had never been to Latin America before March of 1961, and he becomes the White House expert on Latin America. Gosh. And so, that I think tells you something.
He's perfect for the job.
But it is, I'm so glad you brought up the best and the brightest, because it is a kind of pure distillation of the hubris of that kind of technocratic governance. Like, we can just come up with a plan. We don't need to know facts on the ground. We don't need to have any experience in this area. We can just go to our drawing board and figure it out and then implement the plan, and it's going to be awesome. And just like the other best and brightest projects of the 1960s, it does not go well.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we should leave it there. I have not been able to find tape, at least on the internet, of Kennedy's terrible Spanish accent, but maybe a listener can dig it up. I would love to hear that at some point. We will leave it there with that episode, but let's do, before we get out of here, a few also on this days, other things that happened on March 12th throughout the years.
So in 1912, Juliet Gordon Low of Savannah, Georgia, founded the first American troop of the Girl Guides, which later becomes the Girl Scouts, which my daughter is one.
Oh yeah? What is what level?
She is just the brownie level, so just starting out. But she's been loving it.
Has she been pushing cookies?
Yep.
She has.
How many boxes do you have right now?
Last year, she sold 121, which her goal was 100. So I think that's pretty good.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
That's amazing.
I will say I lived in Savannah for a little bit, and the pride that's the home of the Girl Scouts definitely is throughout that city. It's a nice little thing for Savannah.
And also on this day in 1947, President Harry S. Truman announced what became known as the Truman Doctrine to help Greece and Turkey resist communism. very on point with the Marshall Plan talk.
Yeah, you just shouted out Greece as a big pivot point. And then in 2008, in early spring, this March 12th moment, New York Governor Eliot Spitzer announces his resignation. This is following the revelations of his involvement with prostitutes. We've done a very fun episode about this. This was when I was first getting my start in journalism here in New York, and it was quite a moment. But he was the first governor to leave office amid scandal in nearly a century, but then it set off quite a few years of the New York Post was just really in its groove during that period.
It really was. And people should go back and listen to that Spitzer episode because there's so much hypocrisy. There's so many good Post headlines. And he does, as you mentioned, Jody, he sort of sets the model going forward. How are you going to leave office? Resign in disgrace.
I think so. All right.
Go out in a blaze of glory.
We are ending this episode not in disgrace, but in a true blaze of glory. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
It is, as you may have heard, an election year. But do you feel like you have a lot of choices? Here are the new candidates, same as the old candidates. How did we get here again? The fact is, our democracy is broken. We can all feel it, and there's data to back it up, too. A Princeton University study found that public opinion has near zero impact on what laws are passed. You know what does have an impact, though? Money. You can call it lobbying, you can call it super PAC spending, you can call it corruption. But luckily, there are things we can do right now to fix this broken system. This podcast is part of the Pro-Democracy Podcast Coalition, a group that's banding together to make our democracy better. We're working with Represent Us, the largest grassroots organization fighting to end corruption city by city and state by state. You can join the movement too. Go to represent.us/podcast to find out more.
Radiotopia.